Guys, welcome back to another video, and in this video we're going to be continuing on with our iOS development with UIKit tutorial series, and in this particular tutorial we are going to be taking a look at the UI collection view diffable data source. Now what is that exactly? Well, a diffable data source is a type of data source for both collection views and table views. They both have their own variants that handle a lot of the manual work that we had to do previously with the normal UI table view data source or UI collection view data source. In this case, when we had to conform to that protocol in either our view controller or some other object. So what the diffable data source handles is, first, it does for you the number of items, right? So it goes and implements that stuff for you, and then it also implements number of sections for you as well, so you don't have to do those two things. And then it will use what's called a snapshot to help manage the differences from one state of your data to the updated state of your data, and update and animate those changes to the UI as necessary. Now, that particular part with animating the changes is particularly useful because those animations can get pretty complex. And the way that we had to do this prior to iOS 13 was, to say the least, cumbersome. It was difficult, right? So with the diffable data sources, that's made a lot easier for us. About the only thing when it comes to a data source that you need to worry about that has some manual work to it is creating the collection view cells. All right, so how then do we use the collection view diffable data source? Well, let's get started by going into Xcode. And I have a basic collection view set up already, where we have a color cell registered, we have the flow layout configured, we have the delegate and data source configured property-wise, but we don't have a data source property yet to work with. We have our collection view added as a subview to the view. We have a delete button up in the navigation bar, which will be used to delete whatever items you select in your collection view, and all that. So that's kind of where we stand. We can't run the code right now because there are errors that we're going to fix as we move along. So let's go ahead first and create a data source variable. So up at the top of our file, I'm going to go beneath my UI components here, and below the delegate. Well, actually, you know what? Let's put the delegate and data source together. So below the delegate, I'm going to say lazy var data source equals make data source. All right, so let's talk about this statement here real quick. First, we've marked our variable as lazy. Why have we done this? Well, the reason why we've marked the diffable data source or the data source variable as lazy is because we need to make sure that our diffable data source gets initialized after the view controller does. So lazy will help us to defer the initialization until we specifically request it. All right. Then we're calling makeDataSource. This is going to be a method that we're going to put inside of a view controller extension. And all this will do is it will simply return an instance of UICollectionViewDiffableDataSource. My mind is in macOS land. So with that, let's go ahead and create that extension. So inside of our navigator, we're going to right-click that. I'm going to create a new empty file, and this file is going to be called view controller plus data source methods. All right. Now, to make this slightly easier, we're going to create a couple type aliases to begin with in our extension. So before we create the extension, I need to import UIKit. And we'll say extension view controller, like that. And at the top here, we'll create our type aliases. So type alias, we'll call this data source, is equal to, and then the type that we want to work with here is UICollectionViewDiffableDataSource. Now, when we create a diffable data source type, this type takes in two generic type parameters. The first is the enum for differentiating between the different sections of your collection view. So if you want one section, multiple sections, whatever, you can do that. You just have to have an enum with different cases to differentiate them. So in between our angle brackets, we're going to say section. We haven't created this enum yet, but we will. Go ahead and do a comma after the section. And then the second generic type parameter is the type of item that is used to represent your data in your collection view. In this case, it is a color item object. Now, what is color item? Well, color item is an object that I've created. It's a struct called color item. This conforms to hashable. The thing to remember about the item type in your diffable data source is that it must conform to hashable and have some kind of unique identifier. So what I've done inside of color item is I've essentially created an ID constant, which every time you create an instance of color item, gets initialized to a new UUID. And then we have a variable called color, and this is of type UIColor. This is meant to encapsulate the UIColor object that those kinds of objects that populates the color array in the array of UI colors in my constants file. And then to better conform to hashable and ensure uniqueness beyond our UUID, I have implemented the hash method from hashable. And we've pretty much just said hasher.combine, and then we passed it the ID. All right. So that's pretty much what I've done with color item to make sure that this conforms to all the requirements Diffable Data Source requires. And so that is our data source type alias. The second type alias we're going to call snapshot. This type alias is going to be an alias for the NS Diffable Data Source snapshot object, which also takes the same two generic type parameters. Now, as I mentioned, diffable data sources use snapshots to help differentiate between the old state of your data and the new state of your data. And then it uses those snapshots, to do that process of diffing and then animate those changes. So we'll say type alias. We'll call it snapshot equals NS Diffable Data Source snapshot here we'll say section, comma, color item, like that. All right, now that we've created our type aliases, let's create that enum called section. So we'll say enum section case main. And we're done with our section enum. It's literally that simple. Now, if you want multiple sections, you can include many cases. And it's just as simple as creating multiple cases in an enum, right? With comma separated cases. It's just that easy. Nothing too special is required here. All right, so next we need to create a couple methods. First is that make data source method I mentioned. And then second is one that we're going to call apply snapshot. And this will apply a new NS diffable data source snapshot to our data source to begin the process of actually animating those changes and performing that diffing process. So we'll say func make data source, and we'll have it return a data source like that. Inside of this function, we are going to say let data source equals UI, or we have a type alias for this, data source. And so the initializer for the diffable data source takes in a few different parameters. The first one that it takes is the collection view we want to associate with the data source itself. And the second is a cell provider. This cell provider takes in three different parameters. First, it takes in the collection view. Second, it takes an index path. And third, it takes an item. Now, this item is going to be the same type that we specified as a generic type parameter for our data source itself when we created the type. So in this case, item would be a color item, as you can see in the autocomplete. So let's go ahead and fill this in. So pass it our collection view. Then I'm going to use a trailing closure here. We'll say collection view, comma, index path, and item. And then this needs to return this cell provider needs to return a UI collection view cell and make it optional. Now, if you have a custom type, you can change this to an optional version of your custom UI collection view cell, which in my case is color cell. All right, like that, and then have the in keyword there. All right. Okay, so let's get rid of those. Get rid of those parentheses. There we go. All right. So before we actually build the body of our cell provider, let's take a moment and return data source. That way we don't forget it later. All right, now that we've returned our data source object, inside of the cell provider, you put the exact same code that you would for cell for item at in your UI collection view data source conforming object, right? So this is where the diffable data source actually creates your cells for that it will then display in the collection view. We'll say guard let cell equals collection view dot DQ reusable cell with identifier. This identifier is going to be color cell dot reuse identifier, that static property inside of our cell. And then for index path as question mark color cell. If this cannot be casted to a color cell, we will simply return nil. So nothing will happen at that point. Nothing will be returned. After that, we know our cell casting was successful, so we can say cell.set. And inside of here, we'll pass it item.color. And then return cell. Just like that. All right. And that is our make data source method. Let's go ahead and go over what we just did. So the first thing we did was we created a function called make data source. This method is going to return our UI collection view diffable data source object. And of course, we're using our type alias here because That is a really long type, UICollectionViewDiffableDataSource. Hence why a type alias. Okay, then inside of this method, we created a constant called DataSource, which is a new diffable data source object, which again we're using our type alias for. We pass it the collection view that we want our data source to be bound to. Then we also pass it a cell provider. In this case, we're doing it via a trailing closure, which takes 3 parameters: a collection view, an index path, and an item, which is, of course, as I mentioned, the type of the item, the item type our collection view is going to manage, the same type that we specified in our generic type parameters. And then this closure, the cell provider, is supposed to return some kind of optional UI collection view cell. This can be UI collection view cell itself. It can be a custom cell that inherits from that, as long as it just meets the requirement that it has to be some kind of UI collection view cell, and it has to be optional. Inside of the cell provider, we are making sure that we can dequeue, right? We're dequeuing a reusable cell from our collection view with a given identifier. And we want to make sure that this is dequeued for a specific index path. So we're using the index path our cell provider gives us. And then we are attempting to cast this to a color cell. If this casting is not successful, we return nil. If it is successful, then we configure our color cell by calling its set method and passing it the color property of our item, so it has a UI color to work with. Then we are returning that cell. After we've returned our cell, we have our data source object created. And finally, the last thing of this method is we need to return our data source, which we're doing with return data source. And so that is our diffable data source actually created. It's just as easy as creating a method that will return that data source, creating an object that takes in that collection view and a cell provider, and configuring the cell inside of that cell provider. Much less code than if we were to use the UICollectionViewDiffableDataSource and manually manage changes and animating those changes and all of that stuff ourselves. All right. So with that, what I want to do is create another method. And this method is going to be called funcApply snapshot. This is going to take in a Boolean parameter called animate. And I'm going to give this a default value of true. So if you pass nothing, it will automatically assume that you want to animate the changes. If you don't, pass in false. All right. Inside of this method, we need to create a snapshot object. So var snapshot equals a snapshot object. So an NS diffable data source, snapshot object. Then we need to append the sections for our collection view, our collection view's data source. So we'll say snapshot dot append sections. All right. Inside of here, this is going to take an array of sections. And because we only have one, we're going to pass an array of one section of .main. Second, we need to append the items for our snapshot so it can actually perform our diffing process when we call apply on our data source. So snapshot dot append items. Now there are a few versions of this method. The first is just appending items. This is useful for if you have one section and that's it. And then there's one where you can pass in a section to append those items to. This is particularly useful if you have multiple sections and you want to make sure that only specific items get appended to a specific section. I'm gonna use append items only with an array that we pass into it. In this case, it's going to be colors, which is our data array. And then finally, the last thing we do inside of this method is we call data source dot apply. And this will take in an NS-diffable-data-source snapshot. So we pass in snapshot, like that. And we are done with our extension. Make sure there's no errors in our extension. We're okay. Let's save it. Go back to our view controller class. Now, inside of configure, we need to do a couple things. Right. So what we're doing in configure here is we're configuring the layout. Nothing that we need to change there. We're initializing our collection view, setting its data source, allowing selections, allowing multiple selections. We're setting its delegate. We're registering a color cell. And then we're adding the collection view as a subview to the view. We're configuring our button in the navigation bar. The last thing we need to do inside of configure is we need to actually apply our snapshot. So we can do this by calling apply snapshot. Simple as that. Now, let's kind of go over our delete items method, or delete tapped method real quick, which is the action method for our bar button item. Because there is one change we need to make in that method. So all we're doing at the moment is at the top of our method here, we are unwrapping the selected index paths inside of the collection view. So all the items that are selected, we're getting all their index paths. If they are nil, we return, so nothing will happen. Then we're guarding against an empty state. So if the index paths that we receive is in fact unwrapped, but it's empty, we return still because we don't want anything to happen if we don't have anything selected, right? So after that, we then map our selected index paths to an array of color items. After that, we loop through, we chain a for each call, which allows us to loop through that array of color items. And then we remove all color items from our colors array that meet a specific predicate. In this case, if the IDs match from the color item that's given in remove all with the color item that is given to us in our for each. If those IDs match, then remove it. All right, so the last thing that we need to do inside of this method is we need to apply a new snapshot. So it's as simple here as calling apply snapshot. Go ahead and save your code and run it. We have a successful build. And so here's our grid of colors. I'm going to go into our collection view, and I'm going to select some colors here. So we have 12 items in our collection view selected. We can hit the delete button, and when that is tapped, you can see those items are not only gone, but the changes were made internally to allow for animating those changes and updating the UI. So we didn't have to call, for example, delete items on our collection view after deleting data from our array. The diffable data source did that for us. It did all that extra work. So that pretty much does it for this video on diffable data sources for collection views. In the next video, we'll take a look at how we can use UI table view diffable data source. So with that being said, thank you all so very much for watching. Make sure you leave a like on the video if you liked it, dislike it if you didn't. Subscribe to the channel for more content like this, and also follow me on Twitter for more posts and all kinds of other shenanigans. I'll see you then in the next video.